to video 5 where I go over Chapter 5, Activity-Based Costing. Fair warning, some of you are going to fall in love with activity-based costing. You know, we've named it, we're going to spend some time with it. Some of you are just going to fall in love with it. Sorry. Sometimes I hear students describe it after the fact. They say, you know, this is the way it should be. This is the way we should be doing inventory costing. And it does have the advantage of being perhaps the most complete or accurate of the costing methods that we go over, but it doesn't come without its downsides. So I want you to keep that in mind. You know, you might come to love this puppy, but it does pee all over your kitchen. So there are some problems with activity-based costing as well. You might already be familiar with as well, but hopefully I can ground this in the theory we've been developing and position it especially as an extension of job order costing, which I'll get to in a minute. So let's actually go back to Chapter 4 at the very end for just one moment, where we talked about the idea of departmental overhead rates. And so you have Department A, and their overhead operates a certain way. It's primarily related to direct labor hours, you could say, or you could say that direct labor hours as a cost driver works fairly well to approximate how much overhead cost responsibility each product unit has. And you have Department B, and you know they have more machinery. They're the Darth Vader. They're more machine than man now, and so they have perhaps more of their overhead costs tied up in something related to machinery, and so machine hours is a more effective cost driver for that. It more effectively, to put it in full terms, machine hours more effectively approximates the relationship between Department B's overhead and how much overhead cost responsibility each product unit has as it goes through Department B. And so each product then, as it goes through each department, gathers up the direct labor hours from Department A that it incurs, and then that's multiplied by Department A's overhead rate, and then it gathers machine hours, it consumes machine hours from Department B, and then that's multiplied by Department B's machine hour rate, and it's accumulating overhead costs based on this. But the key word in each of those statements is approximate. So even though Department A is probably mostly related to direct labor hours, even though it's more labor intensive than Department B, and I'm certain it has other things that it does that go into overhead costs that maybe are not fairly approximated. They're actually, they don't have a relationship to individual product units that can be approximated from direct labor hours. So you're going to have some error in that department rate. Likewise in Department B, you know, it's not all machinery, and there are probably a number of things that they do there that are not at all related to machine hours. And so your machine hours as a cost driver in Department B is going to miss some of the overhead cost responsibility that each product unit has, because it's only one cost driver among a number of different types of overhead costs in Department B that have a number of different types of relationships to individual product units. So what we start to get into is the idea that maybe that's not a refined enough picture for how much overhead cost each product unit is responsible for, which helps us get to the profitability of each product unit, the pi of I product unit. So sure, department overhead rates are a step up from company-wide overhead rates. They give us a little bit more of a refined picture, but as long as there's a mixture of types of overhead costs within a department, it might not be the case that that's good enough. We might still be lacking some critical information. So now we'll go back to Chapter 5 and start talking about activity-based costing. And I like framing this as an extension of job order costing. Even though theoretically you can use activity-based costing with process costing, so Chapter 6 will go over process costing. You could theoretically use activity-based costing on a process level, on a department level. It loses some of its value when you do that. So the idea is we're trying to get beyond department level overhead rates. And we are assuming that there are a variety of overhead costs in each department that can't be, at least not to the level of precision that we want can't be just approximated by one cost driver. And so we start to get to the idea, well, we'll need to use multiple cost drivers. All right, that's simple enough on its face. And when you start drilling down to how you would do that, you get to, in essence anyway, you backdoor into activity-based costing. So let's break this down a little bit and say we have two products. We have product A and we have product B. Now, product A is a small, let's think it's a candy bar. We have small candy bars, and product B is a large candy bar. So these two candy bars we produce, product A tends to be high volume. We produce a whole lot of these. Product B tends to be low volume. However, we have large batches that we produce product A in. We have very small batches that we produce product B in. So let's just, for the sake of argument, say we have, to make this, put numbers on it, we have volume and then units per batch. We have a volume of 100,000 of small candy bars for this period. We have 50,000 of the large candy bars for this period. And we produce 10,000 units per batch of the small candy bars and 500 per batch for the big candy bars. Now, let's say we're just using traditional volume-driven cost driver here. So we're going to say that cost driver is $3.5. You know what? Let's do the math here. Let's say we have overhead of a couple different varieties. One, we have some direct labor costs and machinery costs. Some direct labor related costs. These are overhead though costs, and machinery costs, not direct costs. And then we also have some maintenance costs. Now, in this example, we're going to go ahead and say that the direct labor and machinery costs are volume related. So there's a very high correlation between volume and these costs. Direct labor related costs and machinery costs both. You know what? If we produce twice as many units this period, we're probably going to use twice as much overhead costs this period. And so they would be a good match for the traditional cost drivers that we use in job order costing. If we're just going to use one cost driver per company or per department, like we did in Chapter 4, then we probably can approximate the relationship between these overhead costs and the individual product unit's responsibility for overhead. And so let's just put some numbers in here. Let's say we have $200,000, and $300,000 of machinery-related costs. Now, maintenance costs. Let's assume that these are not volume related, in the sense that we incur most of these costs when we change batches. So it increases the wear and tear on our machinery to do a new batch, to finish one batch and do a new one. We have to clean the machinery. That's some of the maintenance costs, and we have to employ people who are going to do the changeover between batches. And let's just go ahead and say, just make it a respectable amount with, compared to our other overhead costs. Let's go ahead and sum these, and we have a total of $750,000 of overhead then. Now, we'll just make up some cost drivers. We have direct labor hours, and then we also have batches that we're expecting. And so our direct labor hours that we're budgeting, let's just say we have 20,000 direct labor hours that we're budgeting. Now we'll make it 25,000, make it a little nicer. And then batches, I've already established a relationship here. So we're going to have this volume divided by this units per batch plus this volume divided by this units per batch. And that should be how many batches we're producing. So we're budgeting 110 batches, let's say. Okay, so if we're going to do the traditional cost driver in job order costing, we're going to choose almost certainly we're going to choose direct labor hours. It's going to account for these volume related overhead costs. It's going to approximate the relationship between those and our units that we produce, how much responsibility each unit has for these overhead costs. And we're going to just divide these. And so we have our PDOH equals this divided by this. We end up with $30 per unit is charged. So now we can go ahead and apply overhead. I know that the number that we've gotten here is kind of unrealistic. I mean, we have small candy bars and they're going to be assigned $30 of overhead. We'll just go with the example. These are the numbers we have. It is what it is. Maybe they're very, very nice candy bars. Change your life candy bars. I think you might. Maybe you'll spend $50 with this overhead and direct materials and then some markup. Your price as a consumer will be $50 because they're just life changing. So now we're going to take cost driver consumed, and that's going to be related to the volume that we do. So let's just make it exactly related to the volume that we do. We're going to try to get as close as we can anyway. So we have 150,000 units total. We're dividing our direct labor hours at 25,000. So let's just go ahead and say we have about 17,000 here and 8,000 here. That should equal 25,000. Great. So that's the cost driver consumed. And now we can apply each of these ratably. So now we have a total, all overhead, $750,000 of it applied to each product line. And so it sure looks like product A consumes a lot of overhead, $510,000, and product B consumes very little overhead, $240,000 of overhead. We'll make sure we have these in the right units. Okay. Now let's say for a second we realize, these maintenance costs, they're not volume related, and we really should be getting this information in here. Even though these are life-changing candy bars that sell for $5 or $50 to $100 a pop a unit, we still are in it's difficult to get in the candy bar market, and we need to make sure we're very careful with our costs and that we're charging appropriately and that we're controlling for costs so they don't get out of hand. We want to be accurate. So we decide that we're going to use more of an activity-based costing method here. So now we're going to go over to more of an activity-based costing method, and we're going to say we're going to create two activity pools. We're going to say we have a volume-related activity pool. We'll go ahead and keep using our direct labor hours associated with this, and we have also a non-volume related pool here of 110 batches, 250,000. We're going to create a separate overhead rate for this one right here. So we're going to call this labor-related activities and batch-related activities. Logically, I mean, before we use any sort of special terminology for activity-based costing, we're going to call them cost pools or activity rates or anything like that. Just using our traditional understanding of cost drivers. This relationship right here, this $250,000 is not going to follow the same relationship that these are right here, because these are volume related. They're going to go up and down with volume significantly. Whereas if we produce 100,000 candy bars 1 month that are all small candy bars, we have only used 10 batches. Whereas if we produce 100,000 in volume of candy bars the next month and they're all large candy bars, we have, I don't know, 2,000 or something like that, 2,000 or 200 batches with significantly higher number of batches. So these costs are going to be much more attributable to the second month, where we have all large candy bars. These are not going to move directly with volume. We have the same volume both months. In my example, 100,000 in 1 month, 100,000 the next month. But these costs right here that are not volume related but are related to batches will not be moving on that scale. So let's add a second predictor. If you're into the regression idea, you understand the statistics. We're adding a second predictor, a second coefficient in our regression model. If you don't understand that, don't worry, it's not critical that you do. And so we're going to create a new labor rate. We're going to take our volume related overhead costs, the sum of these two, And make sure that we get that absolute sales. We divide it by the amount of direct labor hours we're expecting. So now we have only $20 for our volume related activities in this new type of overhead that we're talking about. And we're going to color code it for us. Make it lighter. Okay. We're going to create a batch overhead rate here. Just take the batch related overhead cost divided by the number of batches we're expecting, and we end up with a nasty number, but we'll let it run. That helps. Okay, so $2,272 rounds up to $22.73 per batch. So now let's go ahead and see how we can compute this. We have our expected. We need to have. We have DL labor hours consumed. We're going to go ahead and just copy that over. And now we have to split up this 110 expected here. I believe that's 10 from here and 100 from here. So we have 10 expected batches right here and 100 expected batches right here. Batches consumed for consistency. Okay, now we get to multiply each of these. This is our blue. This is our yellow. This is our yellow. This is our blue. So now give me a second. Okay, now we have a different set of overhead costs being added to the different product lines. Now look how much more evenly we see the overhead costs being applied. Look how many more of those maintenance costs are actually going over to product B. When we had just overhead costing, oh, product B looks super great. Those large candy bars looked great. However, they have so few units per batch that we are incurring massive maintenance costs the more large candy bars that we produce, more of this product B that we produce. And when we account for that relationship with a second driver, we now recognize, oh man, product B does not look nearly as good as it did before. So we can calculate the difference in overhead costs that we're applying to each product line. We have $147,000 less applied to product A and $147,000 more applied to product B that before we were ignorant of entirely. Now, are these numbers perfect and accurate? They are not perfect, but they are more accurate than before because we have almost certainly a relationship here that we are accounting for, and we had no accounting for it before. It all went into the error term. And we have the relationship that we are now approximating or still trying to account for. So that's the gist of activity-based costing. We're going to split up our overhead into different groupings that center around a cost driver. And I think this is actually one of the areas in which you're underserved by a lot of explanations of activity-based costing, because we start to get into the idea of activity cost pools, and there's some mystery when students learn about this. So let's start with this diagram right here. I'll tell you what the mystery is that other textbooks talk about and how it's not really a mystery, because I'm just going to repeat what I said before. I'm going to tie it to what I said before, excuse me. So we have right here our same diagram that we produced in chapter 4, where we said we have two different questions we can pose. Is it traceable to product units or not? And if it is, then it's a direct cost, either materials or labor. If it's not, we'd call it overhead, Or we used to have a dash line right here, and we said if it's not traceable to product units and not traceable to product lines overall, it was an SG&A cost. And now we've taken away that second question because we're going to employ as many cost drivers as necessary to trace things to product units, to apply these costs to product units. And some of those costs might actually not be traceable directly to the product lines, but they might be traceable to product units through that relationship of some sort of secondary cost driver. So we're going to get rid of that second line. We're just worried about whether they're direct or indirect. All indirect costs are candidates for being driven into individual product units through some sort of a new cost driver, because we're going to have multiple cost drivers like we used in our example. We're going to try to capture as many meaningful relationships as we have between the costs that we can't trace to product units and those product units. And we're going to try to be as precise as we can while keeping some parsimony. You end up with these companies that go down this rabbit hole and they end up with 100 cost drivers. I'm sure they're getting more accurate with 100 than they were with 50 or with 10, but you start to get to a point of diminishing returns. So you're still there's competing interest between being as accurate as possible with more and more and more and more cost drivers to approximate the relationship between overhead and individual product unit responsibility for overhead, and having a number of cost drivers that is still usable and that you can make decisions off of. Remember our jump from chapter 2 to chapter 3, we said, you know what, you get to a certain number of columns in the table and it stops being usable. It's just we're humans and we have limited ability to direct our attention. So in this example, I said there are 5 cost pools, just groupings that we have decided based on some sort of a study, based on some sort of professional advice, and some sort of expert judgment that we've used. We've said just somewhere this cost pool is driven by XYZ, by a particular cost driver 1 we'll call it. This group of costs over here, overhead costs over here, is driven by cost driver 2. This group of costs over here is driven by cost driver 3. This group by cost driver 4. This group by cost driver 5. And that's the way you should understand it. The way they sell it to you, the consultants, and the way that a lot of textbooks teach it to you, is that you go back into some monastery and you ponder what the real meaning of your firm is. What activities do we actually engage in? And that's a bunch of hokey. I'm sorry, you don't do that. Maybe that's helpful to drive out new cost drivers, but at the end of the day, there is never a cost pool assembled that is not centered around a cost driver. In activity-based costing, it's always centered around a cost driver, or an activity driver, as they call it in activity-based costing. It's always the case. Otherwise, you couldn't implement it. You would just have rantings of some executive in a monastery. That's not very useful. So, no, you have these different groupings of costs in overhead that you say have a relationship with individual product units, and that relationship is approximated by a cost driver that we are measuring and can measure economically and trace to individual product units. Some sort of cost driver we can use as a vehicle with getting these costs into those product units. So it's always centered around the cost driver. Remember that. You're never going to have a cost pool that does not have an associated cost driver. They either happen, the development of cost pools and the discovery of cost drivers that you're going to use either happens at the same time, or discovery of the cost drivers comes first. Almost always the case. So this is a fairly simple idea when you think about it. The idea of using multiple cost drivers, because you've got to accommodate multiple relationships. They're going to have separate rates, right here and a rate here. And when you get to a list, this list went down and had 15 different overhead items, or 20 or 100 or 1,000 different categories of overhead items, it's very possible that you could find a large cornucopia of colors that would approximate the different rates. And so in my example here, I have this light gray blue. That would be one cost pool in activity-based costing, and this yellow would be a different cost pool in activity-based costing. We'd have a different pool of the cost, a different driver, which is direct labor hours, and a different rate, which is the $20 per direct labor hour. Again, remember, we are just developing PDOHs, predetermined overhead rates. And we're calling them different names, but it's mostly for marketing. Remember, this is produced by a number of people who I'm sure they wanted to improve businesses, but they also knew they had this was providing some value to businesses and they wanted to sell it. So we have all new terminology. Consultants like to do that. They like to produce new names. If they have a new name, they can slap it on a book, they can slap it on some training material, and they can create, a new initiative that the company is going to go through, and they will spend thousands and millions of dollars to the consultants to drive. So, first thing we're going to do is redefine overhead. Like I said, we get rid of this dotted line. We're no longer going to worry about an SG&A pool. SG&A just becomes everything we can't. If you cut out these dotted lines, you would end up with this Swiss cheese over here with just the holes. And so that's SG&A. Everything we can't trace through some sort of our activity rates, our cost drivers in these pools, is something we're considering to be a period cost, an SG&A cost under activity-based costing, which is one of the reasons why activity-based costing is not GAAP compliant. You can't use this for your financial statements. So companies have to do double work if they use an activity-based costing system, because they have to have a separate system that does trace costs in a GAAP approved way so that they can use that on their financial statements. Activity-based costing has to be just for their decision making. No, activity-based costing says you have to create a differentiation between product, the bottom lines we had in chapter 4, product costs and non-product costs, and non-product costs have to be expensed in the period. All right, so we've redefined overhead to include everything that's not a direct cost. Then we developed some activity cost pools, which are just these subgroupings of overhead costs that we think share a common relationship through some sort of activity driver. Again, cost pools are always centered around an activity driver. We didn't have a batches cost pool until we decided batches were going to be a driver. We couldn't separate out maintenance costs until we had a driver to approximate the relationship. Now, we then develop individual rates for each of these cost pools. And similarly, we have the budgeted cost pool over the budgeted activity driver. And lo and behold, that's exactly like in chapter 4. Our PDOH rate was our budgeted overhead cost rate over our budgeted cost driver. We're just subdividing our overhead costs into groupings that are approximated by these multiple cost drivers that we've identified. And now we're calling them different names. We can sell more consultant hours. All right, now implementing it, these are two stages. First, we develop the cost pools and we allocate our overall indirect costs into these cost pools. So we end up with these kind of percentage tables oftentimes. We have on the y-axis here of this table, we have a variety of actual general ledger cost categories that we're saying get split into these different activity cost pools. And we have percentages of how much of each of these costs goes to the individual cost pools. We're trying to account for all of the costs in each of these general ledger categories into these new groupings. And so let's say, for example, we have $120,000 of maintenance wages, and we have $85,000 of miscellaneous and administrative costs, and I skipped here, $50,000 of shop supplies. And we multiply those general ledger numbers, budgeted general ledger numbers, by these percentages up here, and we end up with these new groupings. And so we end up summing across the horizontal axis here. We have our new machining group has $137,250 in it, which is made up of some of the shop supplies budget, some of the maintenance wages budget, and some of this miscellaneous administrative budget based on these percentages and these budgeted amounts for those general ledger categories of overhead costs. or SG&A costs in terms of this one right here. Typically, I included my examples in other category because even in that is kind of the catch-all for the Swiss cheese. So all of this right here is the other, where my cursor is going around the circle, all the Swiss cheese that's left over. That's the other. We're gonna choose to have no driver for that. It just ends up being a period cost. So this is going to be our way to account for that. You could do it other ways, but I think this increases the totality of your accounting because you make sure you get 100% of each general ledger apportioned out between the different categories when you have one that specifically says, oh, these are our other categories. These are our period costs that we can't attribute to any of the different cost pools that we're then going to use a cost driver to allocate to individual product units. So that's our what's called first stage allocation. We do a study, or we pay some really highly paid consultants to do a study for us, come up with these cost pools, and they develop these percentage tables for us So then we can take our budget of these general ledger items and transform them into now a budget of activity cost pools. And so now we have the numerators. These are our numerators for our activity cost pools. Remember, we're gonna need the budgeted activity cost pool to develop the activity rate for each of these items, each of these pools. So that's the numerator, and then of course it's not too hard. We then budget our activity drivers as well. Now we have the denominator, and so we can create some rates, some activity rates. And here's my example in the textbook. I've got the two cost pools that I developed right here, 137, 250, and 46.5 in our numerator, and then 5,000 in the denominator here and 500 in the denominator here. We end up with $27.45 per machine hour and $93 per batch start. And each product unit is going to be charged or allocated or applied this dollar amount per machine hour that it consumes and this dollar amount per batch start that it consumes. And so most likely it will receive a fractional amount of this because I'm assuming batches will have more than one unit in them, but this is the charging rate per batch. So yeah, I'll go through an example of how you apply those. That's the second, that is the second stage allocation. And so you end up with the total overhead allocation based on those rates and based on the consumption of each individual product unit. In this case, we're talking about perhaps a job or an order. Remember, this settles nicely into the paradigm from chapter 4 of nameable jobs or numberable orders. And so each job is going to consume a certain number of machine hours and a certain number of batch starts. Each order is going to consume a certain number of those as well. And now we can allocate overhead costs based on that job or order's consumption of our activity drivers. All right, so we have different activity-based management things that we can do. Now that we understand better how our different products interact, for example, in this example, we can now make decisions based on, wow, our product B, our large candy bars are not making nearly as much as we thought. And so either we need to somehow change our marketing and increase the price of that. Maybe there's something we need to do about the batches. Maybe we need to see if there's some sort of a technological change that we can make to increase the number of units per batch so that they're saving on some of those costs. We can now do some management based on this information. So that is fancily called activity-based management. They're the same kind of management decisions you would make under any other system, but now you have additional activity-based costing information. So you call it something different, and you hire new consultants with this new term, and you spend a bunch of money on them as well. Here I talk about the kind of extrapolate on the example that I gave you already here in this lecture. We have, obviously we have some volume-driven product unit level costs that are possible. We have batch level, that's the example that I used. We also have some product line level costs that you can potentially capture with an ABC system that you can't capture as easily or at all with most job order systems. And then you also have some organization sustaining level costs that may or may not be able to be also put into some sort of a driver. So the idea is you have these different strata of costs, and ABC allows you to get into these different strata, whereas typical traditional job order costing and process costing doesn't really do that. We stick at the product unit level, some sort of a driver that is either driven by volume or is volume itself in the case of process costing. So here is an example that I give for a type of activity-based management that you could do. Similar to my example down here, let's change how we do our products. Now we can say certain customers of ours are consuming certain types of costs of ours at different levels. Let's say, for example, let's not jump into the example that I have in the textbook. But let's stick with the example we developed here in the lecture and say, let's say we have one retailer who loves to sell our large candy bars and primarily buys those from us, and another retailer who loves to sell our small candy bars. We're just candy bar producers in this example, and we're using distributors, we're using retailers to reach the customer. Well, in that case, our distributor who is using a lot of product B, assuming we haven't already adjusted the price or tried to change our units per batch, given the facts that I have in this Excel sheet, this is this is bad. That customer is not as profitable to us as we thought before. Now that we have this additional activity-based costing information, we know that we've been undercharging this customer, or at least at the very least, the products that customer is primarily getting from us, we have been under recognizing the costs associated with that. So now we can make a decision about that customer. We can say, if it's bad enough, we might say this is not a distributor worth keeping unless they're willing to change their balance of product A to product B. Unless they take more small candy bars and fewer large candy bars in this example. And I already went over the next couple ideas: product mix and process improvement analysis. That was kind of my first example of activity-based management. Now that we know our different products, we can change the mix of these two products that we sell, maybe change the price point, which will inevitably change a mix as well, the more to changes in our prices. And maybe we can do something as far as process improvement. Maybe this is some way we can improve our costs and say, let's get more units per batch. Let's find a way let's buy a bigger oven that will allow us to fit more candy bars per batch. All right. Pricing decisions again. Now, I hinted at this earlier, but the idea is we can have some real complexity with ABC, and you can get a lot of columns and tables and a lot of different rates floating around, and that becomes really troublesome because you still have in businesses today human decision makers, and human decision makers have a lot of flaws. And one of the flaws that we have is we have singular attention. We are focused animals. We stare at one thing at a time. So we have a limit to how much we can consume at one point and how much complexity we can deal with in our decisions. Now there are very individual differences to this, of course. Some people can deal with more complexity than others, but even at the upper end, there's only so much complexity a decision maker can deal with. So there are a number of ways that you can simplify activity-based costing. The first method to simplify activity-based costing is called time-driven activity-based costing, TDABC. Now, it uses very similar ideas to what we did before, but it simplifies in at least a way. I mean, you might think it's more complicated because you're learning it after you learn traditional activity-based costing. But if you were just starting from scratch, it would be simpler than what you would have to do the first stage allocation for traditional activity-based costing. So this is a simplification of the front end of activity-based costing. So instead of creating these percentage tables and taking your general ledger accounts and multiplying them through that matrix to get on the horizontal lines now, the far right on our table we had the different activity cost pools. Now what we're going to do is simply say we have those here's my example. We have those general ledger categories of costs, and we're just going to start by dividing them by capacity. So we're going to recognize from the outset that there's some sort of a capacity constraint. At least that's implicit in time-driven activity-based costing. And so that is one advantage of it. Besides simplifying, it also incorporates the idea of a constraint, which is one of the reasons why it's commonly used for service departments that have some sort of a time as a constraint. It's a time constraint specifically. Doctor hours, nurse hours, engineer hours, or in this example here, mechanic hours. So let's say we have 2,000 mechanic hours. So that step one is to instead of going through the traditional first stage allocation, our first step is to take our general ledger categories, divide them by this capacity constraint, and which is how we calculate a capacity cost rate. This is our cost per unit of the constraint, of the capacity constraint, our overhead cost per unit of the capacity constraint. And now we're going to estimate how much each of our activities or activity cost pools or whatever takes of our constraint. And so we say that each machine hour that we consume, a unit consumes, will consume 1.25 mechanic hours. Remember, mechanic hours was our constraint in our example. And each batch start consumes 0.75 mechanic hours. And so then we're going to multiply this capacity cost rate that we calculated. Remember, we took these numbers right here, divided them by our capacity constraint, and that's this right here. We end up with $127.50 as our capacity cost rate, or overhead cost per the constraint, which is mechanic hour. And we're going to multiply those by how many units of the constraint we expect each of our activity drivers to consume or be related to effectively. And so we have 1.25, which is our machine hours to mechanic hours conversion factor, and we have 0.75, which is our batch starts to mechanic hours conversion factor, multiplying them by our each one of those, we're multiplying them by our capacity cost rate, and now we end up with effectively activity rates. So we have $159.38 of overhead cost per machine hour, and we have $95.63 of overhead cost per batch start. So we are gaining some advantages. Like in activity-based costing, we still have multiple cost drivers that are going to have at least some level of approximation of different styles of relationships within the overhead cost group as a whole. What we're doing though is we're going to peg it all to our constraint. Maybe the sentence doesn't help that much, but the idea is we're going to now funnel it all through this filter of time on the constraint. And if your overhead cost relationships get distorted or destroyed through that, then TDABC will significantly reduce the informativeness of your activity-based costing. If the relationships between overhead and individual cost units are not compromised significantly by that, then TDABC can significantly simplify the first stage allocation without reducing significantly your the informativeness of your ABC numbers. So it can be a way to simplify things, especially if, again, you're a service firm and a lot of things are simply driven by the capacity constraint, and you really want to incorporate that into, and it's okay to incorporate that into your rates. Let's move on to the next one. Next way that you can approximate is sometimes called in some textbooks an after-the-fact method of approximating activity costing. So you've already done the first stage allocation, and now you want to simplify that mess. You have activity rates, you just have a lot of them, and it's not going to be very useful for decision making, and you're wondering if all of them need to be calculated at all times, because there's some cost to maintaining these, and there's a decision making cost for it. So what we're going to do is we're going to decide, hey, we have some cost pools that are more important than others, and those cost pools, we're going to call them high dollar cost pools, and they're just going to consume the low dollar cost pools. So we start with our total cost of high dollar cost pools, and then we divide each cost pool by that total. So let's assume that the company, the same example we had before from activity-based costing, let's assume the company is not interested in maintaining the finishing activity. They don't want to keep it. They're like, you know what? Having 2 activity drivers is too much. This is not a realistic example, obviously. 2 activity drivers is not too much. But just so we keep this example straight, and you can go from one example to another, let's keep this for now. So we want to get rid of it. It's our low dollar cost pool. So we're going to take it's $46,500 and move it over between machining and other. We're going to split it up ratably based on the proportion of machining and other to each other. And so what we have here is we have our high dollar cost pools are machining and other. So 137,250. 71,250. Let's just take those numbers from right here, and here, and we get 208.50 or 208.5 there as our total high dollar cost pools. And so now we're going to divide each of these by this total to see how much each of these cost pools, these high dollar cost pools, accounts for the overall high dollar cost pool amount. So we can divide this by this, and then multiply that by our 446.5 that we're trying to split out from finishing. So clearly $137,250 is more of the $208,500 than 71,250 is of that. So we have 137,250 divided by 208,250. We end up with, it looks like that's about 66%. So we're going to take 66% of this $46,500, which ends up being $30,609.71, and add that to the machining cost of 137,250. Add this amount, which is just 60% of our 46.5 from finishing, and we end up with a new machining cost of 167,859.71. We do the same thing here with the other category. It's 71,250 originally, and we're going to take this right here, which is our 46,250, and the percent that other is of our high dollar cost pool. So that's 71,250 divided by 208,250, 500. And we end up with about 34%. So that 34% times that 46,500 gives us $15,890 0.29. And when we add that to the existing other costs, we end up with $87,140.71 in other costs now. So we have effectively taken away this category, and we've said, it's not important enough to us to maintain this activity cost pool. We're going to take its cost and divide it ratably between the existing, the remaining cost pools after it's been removed. And you can do that with a large number of cost pools. You could have 15 cost pools and whittle it down to 2 or 3. Now, you're losing some information. You invariably are losing some information when you do that. You're losing whatever relationship was being approximated by this cost driver for finishing, which I believe was machine hours. It was driven by machine hours, I believe. No, batch starts. It was being approximated by batch starts. But you're going to say, you know what? This is not a big enough number. In this example, we're saying it's not a big enough number for us to worry about. We aren't losing much information. In my example with the candy bar products, I made sure that this was large enough that it made a difference. When I was creating these numbers in my head, I said, okay, I need this number, which is going to have a non-volume related and batch related relationship. I need it to be big enough to make a difference in our cost between this number right here and these numbers right here. And it sure did. It sure did. But let's say we decide that's not the case and we just want to get rid of this. Well, then we're going to go use approximated activity-based costing. We're going to go ahead and get rid of this and move its costs over between this $137,250 in machining and the $71,250 in other. Now, like I said, a number of you might feel that activity-based costing is the king. And certainly, if you feel that way, I'm assuming that you're going to feel that way because it certainly does bring the most informativeness to the costing system. It is accounting for as many relationships between overhead and individual costs as possible. It is taking as much of the indirect costs and allocating them on some reasonable rationale to individual product units, and therefore maximizing the accountability of each product unit, giving us information about how much each costs, how much then each product line costs, and more information about how much each team, each customer, each process, each machine, and so on and so forth. It gives us so much more information about how our production works. However, there is a cost associated with this, and if you fixate just on those benefits, you might fall too far in love with activity-based costing. And to use my silly puppy analogy from the beginning, you might miss the times when, old Yeller just has to be put down. So activity-based costing has some costs associated with it as a system, has some downsides. First of all, it's fairly complex. It's harder to make decisions. We had 2 methods at the end here, and there are more that I haven't even covered in this. I think that I picked the 2 most salient methods to fix or to simplify the first stage allocation and then the second stage allocation. And there are other methods too. People have tried to fix the problem of its complexity because it becomes more and more difficult to make information. And you probably see this in your personal life as well. Sometimes getting more information on a topic or having more flexibility on something is not helpful. You need constraints and you need to have a simplified decision space, or you can face paralysis by analysis. You can face a sea of options and your decisions can become suboptimal for a good number of ways, not the least of which is you can just have increased levels of anxiety and negative emotions, and that will impede your ability to cognitively process the information. So it can be very complex, and also it can become a black box. So it's a complex system that people will often say, well, I just know that the numbers come out that way. And the less you understand why things are happening, the less useful the decision system is. It becomes just magic black box, and the company just starts to recreate more and more 2000 Space Odyssey of a bunch of monkeys dancing around an obelisk, and they're not sure why. You don't want that to be the case because you don't have an informed company, and decision makers and managers and even mid-level and lower level employees aren't able to understand why their actions are causing certain effects. And so the complexity becomes a cost in and of itself. Secondly, I go on and on and on this chapter when I lecture on it about how this is a consultant-driven system. So they have new terms for activity cost pools, activity rates. They have new terms for time-driven activity-based costing, which conveniently enough was developed when activity-based costing was, getting to the diminishing return stages, and they needed to refresh the brand. So, oh, hey, there's a new version of it. And we have new terms within time-driven activity-based costing, the capacity cost rate, all these new terms that they can be useful as a memory kludge to help you remember the differences between them, different methods, and the differences for activity-based costing specifically. But they also are partly driven by the fact that activity-based costing is a value proposition that consultants are making to companies. They want your company to implement this system and pay the consultant them money. So they're providing some value to the company, but they're also making some money themselves. So there is a cost associated with implementing and maintaining the system just per se. You have to hire people who can do this. You have to pay for special systems above and beyond your GAAP approved system that are going to monitor your new activity costs. So there is a cost to it that probably precludes a certain number and size of firm from realistically implementing activity-based costing. Like I said, I mentioned there very briefly, if you didn't catch it, let me reiterate, you have to maintain the system as well. Those percentage tables will eventually become out of date. I don't know of many companies that have stagnant relationships between overhead and individual product units. I would assume that as technology changes, as the workforce changes, as management changes, as organization changes, as departments move from here to there and get reorganized and split up and merge together and so on and so forth, that those percentages would change. So you're going to have constant maintenance of the first stage allocation, and then you're going to have a system, and I did mention this before, a system that will do the second stage allocation for you and keep these activity-based costs available and make them available to decision makers. And again, it's above and beyond whatever GAAP approved system that you have. So you're running two separate systems, and you have to believe, if you're going to adopt this, that the information value of it is significant, because there is a significant cost in terms of dollars, time, and complexity that you are incurring by going to activity-based costing. And so there are certain firms where there is very little to be gained from this. And so if you're a firm where you really don't have a lot of heterogeneous types of overhead, they really would not gain much explanatory power by adding a bunch of extra cost drivers, then you don't even need to look at this. This is as a firm. I mean, you as in the class, obviously you need to, because that's just part of the deal. This is one of the things that you need in your tool belt, because you will probably involve, if you have any sort of a career across horizontally across firms, you'll likely have to see some sort of numbers from an activity-based costing firm at some point in your career. Maybe you won't, and if so, well, congratulations. But a lot of you will see this at some point if you deal with numbers and accounting numbers from firms, and especially if you have any sort of, again, horizontal movement across your career from company to company. Some of your companies will have some sort of activity-based element to their costing. And so if your company, though, doesn't find that many varieties of overhead where a significant subcomponent of it would be explained by another cost driver, or significant subcomponents of it would be explained by more cost drivers, then you really don't have to deal with this. And your job order costing system will give you just fine information for its money, for how much that costing system costs the company to maintain. And that's it. Bye.